Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi.
Good morning, Dr. Rubin.
How are you?
Oh, gosh.
Good morning.
You've got such an adorable face. Look at you. Look at you. Morning, Ayo. Good morning,
You know how
Rufai.
to make Dr. Batty blush.
Is that what it is? Is that what it is?
Do black people blush?
Oh, we do. You are today.
You just did. Well, Dr.
You just
Batty.
blush now.
Okay, if a
Yeah,
black,
you
guys are
if a
embarrassing
black man
Dr. Rubin,
blushes,
please.
it wouldn't show.
Even you're still blushing now.
Good morning, Adefemi.
Good morning, my
Morning,
friends.
good to see you.
Lennis, as always, a pleasure to see you too. Let's take a look at what's happening around the world. We'll start in the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Keir Starmer has condemned what he's described as far-right thuggery and says the perpetrators would face the full force of the law. And this is after days of violent anti-immigration and anti-Muslim protests in towns and cities across Britain. Now, the unrest began after 3 girls were killed in a knife attack at a children's dance class in Southport, northwest England last week. Misinformation thereafter spread that the suspected attacker, misinformation spread just after that attack that the suspect involved in that issue was an immigrant and a radical Islamist. Both things are not true. Police have now said the suspect, 17-year-old Axel Ruda Kubana, was not only born in Britain, but is not a Muslim, it is not an Islamic extremist. And they also said that the police are not treating this stabbing attack as a terrorist incident. 140 people have been arrested since Saturday's protests, which have spread throughout cities, as I said, including Liverpool, Bristol, Manchester, where shops, businesses were vandalized and looted. Several police officers have also been injured. I know that we'll come back to have a discussion about this story specifically, but let's move on to some other issues happening around the world. It does seem as though this has been the weekend, the period for protests and demonstrations around the world. In Bangladesh, let's take a look at what's happening there. More than 280 people have been killed since July. 90 of those people were killed on Sunday alone. This is amid worsening clashes between police and anti-government protesters. Now, the unrest in Bangladesh comes as student protesters demand Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina step down. 13 police officers have also been killed and thousands of people attacked. Thousands of people did attack a police station in the northwest of the country over the weekend. Now, the student protests started with a demand to abolish quotas in civil service jobs just last month. But that has now ballooned into what we're seeing here as a wider anti-government violent movement. And lastly, let's head over to the United States, where Donald Trump is finally talking policy. Now, a few weeks after promising to eliminate taxes on tips, former President Donald Trump has unveiled a second proposal for targeted tax relief. Now, the beneficiaries this time would be senior citizens, which is certainly an influential voting bloc. Now, in an interview that aired on Sunday, Trump spoke about his plans to cut taxes on Social Security benefits, but he didn't actually specify how he's going to pay for it. If we give you a teeny-weeny background on this new Social Security benefit and how they are taxed, currently senior citizens, they don't owe taxes on their benefits if they earn less than $25,000 per individual or $32,000 if they are a married couple, or so-called combined income, which takes into account adjusted gross income, half of their Social Security benefits, and non-taxable interest. Anything above that threshold, they may have to pay income tax up to 50% of their benefits, with revenue going into the Social Security Retirement Trust Fund. So it does need some money to go back into the pot so that they can continue fulfilling their social needs. So that's what Donald Trump says that he's going to cut. I can imagine that in the short term, it will reduce, of course, the outgoings of people. But again, this is not going to be a viable long-term solution because this money has to find its way back in. So it'd be interesting to hear what plans he has on financing this idea. But as I said, we're looking at a lot of protests, first in the United Kingdom, in Bangladesh. Rufai, what are you thinking?
A couple of things. So we're having this debate when we came in. And you, Femi,
yes,
you are British. You know the UK.
I'm a Nigerian, please. Please. I'm with you, don't worry.
But you understand that there's been a rise of far-right nationalism hitherto in Britain. Sorry to say this, there's a massive racist appeal in Britain. You schooled in Wales.
In Wales, yes.
And you know it. All of this have been heightened with the evolution of the likes of Nigel Farage,
yes,
with the UKIP party. Also, with some Tories initially they came out as Eurosceptics. When you say Euroscepticism, wasn't it a variant of nationalism?
BNP.
All of that coincided with Brexit. In fact, the riot you're seeing, and by the way, I was looking at that picture because I lived in Bristol. That was just so close to where I used to live in Bristol at some point. There used to be a restaurant there called Bella Vista. It's an Italian restaurant.
Let's hope it's still there with all of the burning and looting.
In fact, I saw it yesterday. Truth is, all of this Reform Party doing so well. Who are those voting for Reform? It's not right-wing nationalism. Yeah. So there's a clash of culture, and it's not only in England. It's all over Europe. Go to the Netherlands, you have Geert Wilders. Go to France, you have Marine Le Pen. Go everywhere all over Europe. And it has come to stay because these people feel threatened. And it has constantly always been the case. It even dates back to the...
What are they threatened by, though, in this situation? What is actually fueled this?
Just need an excuse to
They are threatened by the fact that London is no longer white.
Is it today?
It's not today.
Is it today? London has always been multicultural.
Wait, no. But the London you know in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, is no longer white. Most of the names you hear on the street in London today is Ahmed. You no longer hear Mr. Smith and Spencer. So that's what fuels all of this. So all they need are triggers. The triggering was...
And I was saying so they needed an excuse, a trigger.
But the argument I was making with you is, they have constantly been far-right riots and struggles and all of that.
In my estimation, not like this. In my estimation, not like this. The last time you've had such tensions around ethnicity and religion was during the 7/7 bombings in July 7 bombings in the UK.
No,
I say that because
many after that.
there have been, but it's been simmering and bubbling under. I remember afterwards, the government did a massive community-led action to galvanize and engage young people from minority ethnic groups. They spent a lot of money, and that's why possibly when Nigeria gets the kinetic and non-kinetic, because it was non-kinetic drive as much as legislation around anti-terrorism and stop and search and around those things at the time. But now, what's happened and what's triggered this particular issue is what we've talked about all through last week, the killing of those young girls. If they were adults, maybe it wouldn't have been as emotive as this. But innocent, defenseless girls who did nothing to the young man, and that in itself, so we condemn that outrightly. But what makes matters worse is that what far rights do is when they seize an opportunity like this and use that to stoke sentiments of people who are in mourning, who are sad, and who are upset. And so even before the identity of the perpetrator came out, they already tagged this and said, this was motivated by Muslims. And it then, opened up that it wasn't.
Fake
now,
news.
let me now move on to the response of the government. And this is where the Labour government, perhaps one of the biggest tests, having come into government, is that they've talked about how the justice system will be revived to ensure that everyone who was found culpable, about 150 arrests have been made already, will be brought to book. In fact, they said they opened up the courts over the weekend so that they were immediately tried and justice would be served. And this is a response. And then the coming out of the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, to speak out and condemn and say that this is not Britain, this is not the UK. So I believe that there's so many things it's still ongoing, so I'm sure we'll still have conversations around this.
Well, right-wing nationalism is a major problem in Europe, as it is also in the United States. So you have the rise in the West of people saying, no, this is our country. We do not want migrants, whether they're legal or immigrant or illegal, to come in. Now, what has happened in the United Kingdom, in Britain, you put your fingers correctly on it, the killing of those 3 girls in Southport, Merseyside, in England, north of England. Now, that triggered riots. Why? Because of the evil of misinformation, of disinformation. This is the big issue in this particular conversation. The fact that people went and said, it is these Muslim immigrants that have killed our daughters, 7, 6, 8. And then people started saying, well, I'm British till I die. Those protesters in Sunderland, in Southport, in Liverpool, who attacked mosques and who confronted the police, they were saying that this is our country and that immigrants cannot come here. What the police did, the Merseyside police did at some point, was to disclose that, in fact, the boy, the 17-year-old boy who committed the crime, is a British-born child with Rwandese
background, parents. So not this on Thursday and Friday.
Yeah, not that he's some immigrant from a Muslim community.
Right.
So this is the danger of misinformation, and we have also seen the danger here in Nigeria. Now, what lessons can we learn from Britain? Yesterday, Keir Starmer addressed the nation. He came out. He spoke. Yvette Cooper, the minister in charge of the Home Secretary, also came out and spoke. Our own president in Nigeria, one of the criticisms against him was that he spoke too little, too late. You don't wait till the last minute before you come out to speak. Another story that was of interest to me is the escalation of crisis in the Middle East. In the Middle East, the UK, Britain, the US have asked their citizens to leave Lebanon immediately. Jordan, Turkey have also asked their citizens to leave. Canada too has told the citizens to leave because the US is deploying vessels in the Middle East to defend Israel because they have a watertight pact with Israel to defend Israel.
Right.
Iran is saying that we're going to retaliate with the killing of Ismail Haniyeh and the killing of the the military commander of the Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yes.
So the situation in the Middle East is very testy and is very frightening. The world is at the brink of an all-out war in the Middle East.
There is that. So we can imagine that these allies, as you mentioned, the United States, United Kingdom, would do well to calm things down rather than escalating them further. Let's take a look at our newspapers. We'll start in Nigeria. And again, going back to the president's address over the weekend, there have been mixed reactions. This day are calling it knocks and commendations and say that they've been trading Tinubu's broadcast over these protests. And it goes on to quote different feedback from different voices. For example, Vice President Atiku Abubakar says the president's speech was hollow and failed to address the basis of these protests. If we take a look now at the front page of the New Telegraph, again, we are also talking about the fallout from the president's address. Many, in terms of the articles on this front page, are deeming his candor, his words, being too divisive and does not address the core issues the protesters have been calling for, especially when you're putting some of his facts into context, as you mentioned, Rufai. Meanwhile, another story on the front page of the New Telegraph, the Lagos State Governor, he has commended protesters for calling off actions, which actually hasn't been the case because we are told that protests are ongoing here in Lagos State. But he's also urged vigilance amongst Lagosians. Sanwo-Olu had directed the continuation of dialogue with various groups across the state, particularly youth and protest leaders. Now, as I said, protests are continuing in Lagos, but it would be interesting to see what it is about Lagos, or perhaps the governor's speediness and readiness in coming out to address the people, perhaps that had made all of the difference. A lot of people were talking, exactly right, and a lot of people may have anticipated that what we were seeing in the north of Nigeria would have happened in the south, but that clearly didn't happen, and perhaps that could be kudos to the Lagos State Governor coming out and addressing the people. Let's take a look at the front page of The Guardian, and the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment, the Honourable Doris Uzoka-Anyite, she says that the 52 billion naira worth of looting is a setback to entrepreneurs and investments, again condemning this loss as it pertains to these protests. She also noted that the overall cost of the country was closer to 500 billion naira, and she's also called for constructive dialogue from the protest leaders in order to bring an amicable end to the protests across the country. And then, Dr. Reuben, I know you mentioned Professor Wole Soyinka's comments and criticisms. The Punch have picked up on that as well. On the front page of the Punch, Soyinka has given his thoughts to the president's address, saying that it did not mention police brutality, and says that protesters are demanding the release of the 1,150 people who have been detained so far. Let's look at the Vanguard. Vanguard is it's given former military president General Ibrahim Babangida the opportunity to disassociate himself from a post circulating over the weekend, associating him to have endorsed the virtues of military rule over democratic governance. He released a statement on X, completely distancing himself, saying that this was a parody account and that he does believe in the sanctity of democracy and has called on Nigerians to do the same. We move on to our African papers now. and the Daily Nation of Kenya are looking at the faces behind the Ruto and Raila political deal, close allies of the opposition chief Raila Odinga, at the heart of this political deal with President Ruto, and they held a series of late-night meetings before the naming of a new cabinet. And then in South Africa, the front page of The Citizen is asking who is really in charge of the government of national unity. Now, the ANC, the African National Congress, says it is in the driving seat of this coalition amid criticism of it joining forces with the White Party. Meanwhile, the DA, the White Party in question, says that this is an equal partnership, but both say that their commitment is to the GNU's success going forward. And then if we look at our international papers, again, we're talking about these far-right protests. You've got the front page of the Daily Telegraph, but also on the Daily Mirror, you've got this rampage, the UK under siege, a migrant hotel was attacked for another day. And as we've already said, Keir Starmer has warned that those involved will regret what they have done. And then lastly, on the Daily Express, again, talking about how hotels used to house migrants are being targeted, almost burned down by these protesters in what have been the most shameful scenes that we've been seeing.
You see, so a couple of things I ever want to say. Yeah. There's also a massive hypocrisy on the part of Keir Starmer himself.
How so?
And I'm going to tell you how. When the Labour Party was dogged with a lot of problems as regards race relation, as regards how Jewish people were being ostracized in the party, what position did they take? So all of this far-right rhetoric, all of this we are pure line English rhetoric,
right,
came from the political class. Look at the last election. Look at reform. Look at the proliferation of far-right television stations. Look at the television station now on air, GB News, constantly spewing this narrative.
Where is that? I will say that many people say that Keir Starmer's leadership, even his own words during the election, said that he's rooted out any form of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, kind of kicked it towards Jeremy Corbyn, which he is not. He's clearly not an anti-Semite.
Which he just sidestepped. So what was the effect of what they did? I mean, Ayo and I were just checking through some data. It's not today that we've had race riots like this. But what did the political class themselves do while all of this was happening? How did they work at condemning it? And secondly, how did they try to be able to balance the equation out? Probably save for Boris, which started leveling up. Because obviously, you know, one of the reasons for leveling up was because people in the deeper disadvantaged parts that feel they are pure British, they feel the opportunities are being taken away by the immigrants that are coming in. Hence the leveling up narrative. So there's a lot of maladjustment that is going on in the British structure of society itself.
Right.
And that's what I was telling you about. One of the grounds of these people is the fact that we are poor, they are coming to take our opportunities. Britain is quickly changing.
It's a mess. You remember, before you come in, Ayo here, you remember Enoch Powell's speech decades ago, and he started this entire rhetoric of immigrants coming to take their job. At first it was the Windrush generation coming to take.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is, it's so underhanded, and it's just not true. Yeah. Because if we're talking about economy, if you actually go into these,
it's not true.
Exactly, it's not true.
But
if you go into these communities,
these politicians
people do not actually want to work.
I think that the moment we started talking about a cost of living crisis in the UK, we should know that this was coming up.
Yes,
because it happens all the time, and it doesn't happen just in Britain alone. Right. Anytime there's an economic crisis, it fires up race or ethnic tensions, because people start to point fingers, and then obviously there's an unrest, people are hungry, people can't afford things, and the first people you're quick to point your fingers at are the immigrants, are people that don't look like you, or you feel like they've come in to take your job. Which jobs do they come to take? Jobs that they're not willing to do? Jobs that they would rather go on welfare than do the job. And this we've looked at this, it's such an age-long argument that we should have stopped, but it will continue. And this is not the only time. Every time, and just check historically, every time there's an economic crisis, it's very easily ramps up race tensions, and then the voices of the BNP or people like Nigel Farage gets heightened, as opposed to when things are prosperous and we're like, oh, we love everybody coming to our nation, and we love that. But let me now, so I'll just use that again side by side with what's happening in Nigeria as well. It's the same thing. When the elections happen, politicians, going back to what Rufai said about the politicians themselves are supposed to be held responsible because they use it when it's to their advantage. When it's to their advantage, they bring up the race card. And then when it's okay, they then say, oh, we condemn everything, we don't want it. So it's just talking about how rhetorics and communication over the years can degenerate to such crisis and they're unable to handle it.
Okay, race, identity, politics will always be big issues in national jurisdictions. And in this situation that they have in Britain, where they are rioting in about 19 communities, the role of the social media is also a central part of the conversation. Now, I've spoken about the Middle East, I've talked about Britain. What remains is to talk about the United States. Tomorrow, Kamala Harris is going to have a rally in Philadelphia. Yes. And the big issue is, who is she going to choose as a Democratic running mate as she goes on this campaign in the battleground states? Yeah. Now, the United Auto Workers, they are recommending Andrew Beshear, and they are saying they don't want Josh Shapiro, the governor from Minnesota, right? And that they don't want from Arizona, Senator Mark
Kelly. Who is actually my pick. I actually think he'll be one to pick.
The Democratic Party is divided right down the middle, and they are lobbying for who their favorite is. Yes. But we expect that by tomorrow, when Kamala Harris shows up in Philadelphia for that rally, we will know who the candidate. Since Friday, she has become more or less the nominee of the party. She has taken about $310 million in fundraising. Right. But the big issue again is between him and Trump. Trump now looks like he's scared. The controversy over whether there should be a debate on September 4 with Fox News that Trump prefers, or on September 10, as previously scheduled, on ABC News. So you see, the media can be very powerful. I guess in Nigeria here, if we call for a presidential debate, some people will say they don't want to come to Arise News. They will say they prefer to go to
I want to why politicians don't want to come to Arise News.
We are inviting them to come, but they say they would rather go.
They should come.
There are some governors that have not done interviews so far. So it's not, leaders.
Anyway, that's the way it is.
All right, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Always great to see you.